My name is Silas Vance, and I have worked as a freelance timber cruiser for nearly 20 years. For those unfamiliar with the profession, logging companies and conservation groups hire people like me to go deep into old-growth forests to assess the volume, species, and overall health of the timber in specific designated sectors. Most of my work is solo, highly remote stuff. I am usually camping out for days at a time in deep wilderness areas where nobody else is going, far beyond the reach of any cellular service or paved roads. I actually prefer it that way. I have always enjoyed the absolute silence and the isolation. Or, at least, I used to. This happened about 3 years ago. I had been hired to survey a massive, unmapped parcel of land on the western edge of the Olympic Peninsula in Washington state, right near the boundaries of the Hoh rainforest. Remote does not even begin to describe this particular area. The environment there is incredibly oppressive. The towering Sitka spruce and western hemlock trees are entirely draped in thick, hanging moss, and the canopy is so dense that it feels like twilight, even in the middle of the afternoon. It was an 8-mile hike off the main abandoned logging roads just to reach the starting grid where I needed to set up my camp. I filed my route with the local ranger station in Forks, just like I always do, and I packed a heavy internal frame pack with a week's worth of supplies. The first 2 days went smoothly. I found the old boundary markers, logged my grid coordinates, measured the required plots, and made it back to my campsite well before it got too dark to see. The weather forecast had called for continuous light drizzle, which is the standard condition for the peninsula, and that is pretty much what I got. By the morning of the third day, however, things started to change drastically. A massive Pacific storm rolled in off the coast a full day early. We got way more rain and high-speed wind than expected. The forest floor rapidly turned into a deep, slick soup of mud and decaying pine needles. The next survey marker was only about a mile out of my way, so instead of calling it right then and there and hunkering down in my tent, I figured I would just push through, get the final measurements, and be able to hike out early the next morning. That was a monumentally stupid mistake. I honestly still think about how arrogant it was not to just shelter in place or make it out of the woods when I had a clear chance. The terrain was a nightmare of rotting deadfalls, slick roots, and hidden rocky ravines covered by massive ferns and fresh mud. It was the worst possible conditions to hike through. I was picking my way down a steep, muddy embankment, trying to maneuver my heavy pack around a massive uprooted Douglas fir when my boot hit a sheer patch of wet clay that I never saw. One wrong step like that in the backcountry, and you could die. And I mean that literally. I slid forcefully down the embankment, dropping about 12 feet, before my left leg caught violently in the V shape of exposed tree roots. The pain in my left knee was blinding and instant. I felt a sickening pop. I tried to tell myself I was fine, but the moment I dragged myself out of the roots and attempted to stand up, I audibly screamed in pain. My knee completely buckled. I could not put even a fraction of my body weight on that leg, and I knew immediately that I had severely torn something. I was trapped, miles from my vehicle, and it would be hours of agonizing effort before I would be able to make it back. I was so mad at myself, but there was nothing I could do. I abandoned the rest of the work right there. There were no timber measurements worth getting stranded and dying of hypothermia over, because my heavy frame pack was throwing off my balance and making the pain unbearable. I was forced to abandon it in the mud. I grabbed my emergency kit, my flashlight, and a thick branch to use as a walking stick. I painfully dragged myself back uphill to the main game trail and started the incredibly slow, excruciating hike back toward where my truck was parked, deciding to bypass my camp entirely. After about an hour of dragging my useless leg through the rain, I noticed boot tracks on the muddy trail. They seemed to have come from further into the dense brush on my left. They were heading in the exact same direction I was going, and they looked incredibly fresh. I could tell by how sharp the edges of the treads were in the mud, despite the fact that the torrential rain should have washed them away quickly. I figured it was probably an illegal poacher, or maybe a drifter hiding out in the deep woods. It is not entirely unusual to cross paths with off-the-grid individuals out there, even in remote areas. I didn't think much of it at first. I just kept moving, leaning heavily on my stick, trying to keep as much weight off my ruined knee as possible. As the late afternoon light started rapidly fading into a suffocating black, I began hearing sounds behind me. At first, I chalked it up to normal forest noises, the wind howling through the canopy or dead branches falling. But the more I listened, the more it sounded like deliberate footsteps. I was dragging my left leg, stepping heavily with my right, and planting my wooden stick. Step, drag, thud. After a few minutes, I realized there was an echo to my movements coming from the trees. Step, drag, thud. And then, a second later, from the dark ferns, step, drag, crunch. I kept turning around and shining my flashlight over my shoulder, but I couldn't see anything. That part of the Hoh rainforest is overwhelmingly dense, so if someone was tracking me just inside the tree line, there is a very good chance I wouldn't have been able to see them anyway. I stopped walking, and the sound stopped too. Not right away. There was a delay of maybe 1 or 2 seconds, letting me know that they were reacting to me, but they stopped. I froze up and tried to listen for anything out of the ordinary, but there was nothing beyond the deafening rain. I started walking again, and this time the footsteps didn't resume immediately, so I foolishly thought everything was fine. But then, a few minutes later, I heard those damn footsteps again. I kept turning around, but the darkness was absolute. It was especially terrifying because I knew I wouldn't be able to run if there was an actual threat out there. That was the worst part. I would have loved to investigate or confront whoever was stalking me, but I didn't have the mobility to do so. I just kept moving. Then, I heard something metallic, off to my left. It was this low, heavy sound, like a piece of rusted iron, being dragged lightly against the bark of the trees as the person walked. It was freaky, because there wasn't supposed to be anything out there but wet wood and dirt. The metallic sound distracted me, and it dawned on me that I hadn't been keeping track of those muddy footprints I had noticed earlier. I looked down with my flashlight and realized they were gone from the main path. I frantically shined my light around, trying to see when they had branched off. I kept looking to my left, trying to pierce the wall of vegetation. My eyes locked onto something in the mud, and the alarm bells started going off in my brain. There was another set of fresh footprints coming out of the tree line on my left, but they weren't on the trail. They were running parallel to mine, weaving purposefully through the dense brush. They weren't that far away, maybe 20 feet, which was the most concerning part. Whoever had been ahead of me on that trail was now intentionally walking alongside me through the trees, staying just out of sight. At that point, I was operating on pure, unadulterated panic. I wasn't thinking straight. I should have kept my mouth shut. I should have just kept moving silently. But instead, I yelled out, asking if anyone was there and telling them I was injured. I didn't get an answer. After about 20 seconds of agonizing silence, I knew I had to get out of there. But my ruined knee was sending shock waves of pain through my entire body. I wanted to run, or at least jog, but I physically couldn't. I was getting close to the abandoned logging road where I had parked, so I told myself if I just pushed through the pain and kept moving, I would survive. I wasn't hearing the metallic dragging sound anymore, which I prayed was a good sign, but I knew there was a person out there. I was painfully close to the gravel road when I heard the distinct sound of heavy boots stepping onto the gravel from somewhere behind me. It obviously wasn't a natural animal sound. I didn't stop moving. I kept thinking about how, if I just made it to the truck and locked the doors, I would be safe. Eventually, my flashlight beam hit the reflective bumper of my truck. It was completely dark at that point, and the rain was blinding. I hobbled to the driver's side door, my hands shaking so badly from the cold and the adrenaline that I could barely fish the keys out of my pocket. I dropped them in the mud. I fell to my good knee, frantically digging my fingers into the freezing dirt to find the metal ring. I was maybe 60% scared of whoever was out there, and 40% terrified of the fact that in a physical fight, I would be completely helpless. Before I found the keys, I heard the thing I had been dreading the whole time: the heavy crunch of gravel right behind me. The footsteps weren't rushing me. They were slow, deliberate, and methodical. They stopped about 10 feet away. I found my keys, clutched them tight, and slowly turned around, raising my flashlight with a trembling hand. There was a man standing on the logging road, blocking my only path back. He was tall, gaunt, and looked completely feral. He was wearing an oversized, rotting yellow rain slicker, covered in dark stains and mud. His hair and beard were long and matted to his pale face, and his eyes were wide, sunken, and unblinking. In his right hand, he was holding a long, rusted steel pipe, resting it casually against his leg. He looked absolutely deranged, like someone who had been living out in the damp darkness for years and had lost every shred of his humanity. I stared back at him, from my knees in the mud. I was fully expecting him to step forward and crush my skull with that pipe. He definitely could have. I slowly put my free hand up and said, completely breathless, that I didn't want any trouble, that I was just leaving. He didn't respond. He just tilted his head slightly, staring at my severely swollen, ruined leg. I didn't know what to do. The staring contest lasted for what felt like 10 minutes, with the rain pouring down between us. Then, his face twitched, and he said something I still think about every single day. His voice was raspy and raw, like he hadn't used it in months. He said, "You're lucky you walk so loud. I prefer the quiet ones." He gave me one last dead-eyed stare, turned around, and walked slowly back into the black tree line, dragging the rusted pipe behind him. He disappeared into the ferns. The rest of that night is entirely blurry. I scrambled into my truck, locked the doors, and drove out of there recklessly, not caring about the pain in my leg every time I hit the clutch. When I finally got to a hospital, I was told I had completely torn my ACL and meniscus. It required extensive surgery and physical therapy. I ended up reporting that drifter in the woods to the state troopers, giving them a detailed description and the coordinates of the trail. They took a report, but I know they never found him. The Hoh rainforest is too vast, and people who want to disappear in there usually do. I didn't take another contract for over a year. I still do remote timber cruising. It is my livelihood, and I am highly skilled at it. But I do not ever go into the deep woods alone anymore. I either bring an armed partner with me, or I turn the job down entirely. I have faced bears, extreme weather, and severe injuries, but that man in the rain is still the scariest thing that has ever happened to me. My name is Kalen Thorne, and I have spent my entire adult life navigating the unforgiving terrain of the American West. I grew up in Pinedale, Wyoming, and by the time I was 22, I was working full-time as a high-altitude search and rescue specialist and winter survival guide. I am intimately familiar with the feeling of absolute isolation. I have spent countless weeks completely alone in the backcountry. I do not get rattled easily, and I never panic. Or, at least, I firmly believed that about myself, until a specific expedition 4 years ago. My climbing partner at the time was a man named Soren Caldwell. Soren was a sponsored mountaineer and a veteran of multiple Himalayan ascents. He was, without exaggeration, the most capable outdoorsman I had ever met. We had been planning a brutal, multi-day winter traverse through the Wind River Range, specifically aiming to cross the frozen Continental Divide near the Cirque of the Towers. It is an incredibly hostile environment in February, but we were over-prepared, carrying top-tier alpine gear and satellite communication devices. The first 2 days were demanding but spectacular. The skies were crystal clear, and the snowpack was incredibly stable. We were making excellent time, skiing between established base camps and navigating by GPS. On the evening of the second day, the barometric pressure suddenly plummeted. The weather reports had indicated a mild front moving in, but the mountains create their own unpredictable microclimates. By dawn, we were trapped in a blinding, localized whiteout blizzard. The wind was registering at nearly 60 miles per hour, dropping the wind chill to 40 below zero. We made the call to immediately abandon the traverse and push aggressively toward a lower elevation ranger cabin located about 14 miles away. The visibility was less than 10 feet. Everything was a swirling, disorienting wall of gray and white. Soren took the lead, breaking trail through the deep powder. I was following directly in his tracks, keeping my head down against the ice crystals that felt like shards of glass hitting my face. I do not blame him for what happened next. It was purely a horrific stroke of bad luck. 1 second, Soren was pushing forward through the drift, and the next, the ground simply vanished beneath him. He had unknowingly skied onto a fragile snow cornice overhanging a deep, jagged boulder field. The snow gave way, and he dropped almost 20 feet directly onto the exposed granite below. I heard the sickening crack of bone over the howling wind. I carefully navigated down the slope and found him pinned between 2 massive rocks. His right femur was completely shattered, the bone protruding through his insulated snow pants. The blood was already freezing against the fabric. Soren was in blinding agony and rapidly going into shock. A broken femur in those temperatures is almost always a death sentence. We both knew the grim reality of the situation. I tried to use my satellite messenger, but the thick cloud cover and the steep canyon walls completely blocked the signal. I could not carry a 200-pound man out of a rocky ravine in a blizzard. There was only one option. We did not even debate it. I spent 40 minutes frantically digging a snow trench to shield him from the wind. I wrapped him in my emergency thermal bivvy, gave him every painkiller in our med kit, and packed snow around his leg to slow the bleeding. He looked at me, his lips already turning blue, and told me to ski as fast as I could. I left him there, buried in the snow, knowing there was a very high probability he would be dead before I returned. I climbed out of the ravine and pushed myself to the absolute physical limit. I was skiing blindly, navigating purely by a compass bearing, heading toward the GPS coordinates of the ranger cabin. The wind was deafening. After about 3 hours of relentless exertion, exhaustion and dehydration began to severely impair my judgment. The landscape was completely unrecognizable in the whiteout. I started to feel that terrifying creeping sensation that my bearing was slightly off and that I was skiing in a massive circle. Then, through the dense curtain of falling snow, I smelled wood smoke. It was faint, but unmistakable. I angled my skis toward the scent, assuming I had miraculously found the ranger cabin. But as the structure slowly materialized out of the blizzard, my heart sank. It was not the official, well-maintained state cabin. It was a crude, brutalist structure, built from salvaged corrugated steel, heavy logs, and black tar paper. It was built into the side of a small hill, almost completely camouflaged by the massive snowdrifts. There was a rusted metal pipe serving as a chimney, and thick smoke was pouring out of it. Smoke meant fire, and fire meant a person, or at least a way to raise my core temperature before I froze to death. I unclipped my skis and waded through the waist-deep snow to a heavy wooden door. I pounded on it, screaming over the wind, announcing that it was a medical emergency. Nobody answered. I tried the heavy iron latch, and the door swung open. I stepped inside, pulling the door shut against the storm. The heat from a small cast iron stove hit me like a physical wave. The shack was incredibly small, maybe 10 by 10 feet, and smelled overwhelmingly of rendered animal fat, unwashed clothes, and something distinctly metallic and sweet. It was clearly inhabited, but completely empty. There was a dirty sleeping bag on a cot, a pile of chopped wood, and a pot of something thick and gray simmering on the stove. I stood by the fire, violently shivering as my body began to thaw. I pulled out my satellite device again, hoping the structure's elevation might give me a signal, but the screen remained completely dead. I knew I couldn't stay long. Soren was bleeding out in the snow. As I turned toward the door to brave the blizzard again, my eyes fell upon a heavy wooden table, tucked into the dark corner of the room. Arranged meticulously on the table were several items that made my blood run completely cold. There were 3 sets of car keys, 2 tarnished wedding bands, a cracked smartphone, and a pile of dirt-stained driver's licenses. I slowly walked over and looked at the IDs. They belonged to different people, men and women from different states. Next to the pile was a thick, leather-bound ledger. My hands were shaking, but I opened the book. It was not a trapper's journal. It was a detailed, obsessive log. There were dates going back nearly a decade. Next to the dates were incredibly disturbing physical descriptions. Things like female, blonde hair, blue jacket, walked with a limp, lasted 4 days. The entries were entirely devoid of humanity. They were written like inventory. I realized with absolute, paralyzing clarity that I had not stumbled into a hunter's refuge. I had walked directly into the lair of a serial predator who used the vast wilderness to hunt human beings. The realization hit me so hard that I actually felt nauseous. The tiny shack suddenly felt like a cage. I dropped the ledger and lunged toward the heavy wooden door. But before my hand could even touch the iron latch, I heard a sound. It did not come from outside in the wind. It came from directly beneath my heavy winter boots. It was a violent, desperate thudding against the floorboards. I looked down and noticed a heavy iron ring bolted into a section of the floor, secured by a massive, rusted padlock. Someone, or something, was slamming their fists against the wood from underneath. And then I heard the voice. It was a woman's voice, hoarse, broken, and muffled by the heavy timber. She was sobbing and screaming, begging for whoever was up there to please let her out. She was screaming that she was so cold and so incredibly thirsty. The sound was the most horrifying thing I have ever experienced. Pure, unadulterated human agony. I froze, my hand hovering over the door latch. The sheer terror completely overrode my rationality. I knew with absolute certainty that if the owner of the shack returned and found me inside, I would end up in that dark hole beneath the floor. I couldn't break the heavy padlock. I didn't have the tools, and I didn't have the time. Soren was dying miles away, and a predator was out there in the storm. I ripped the door open, throwing myself back into the freezing whiteout. I frantically clipped into my skis, my hands fumbling uncontrollably. I skied away from that nightmare, pushing my body harder than I ever thought possible. I did not look back. I just listened to the howling wind, praying it would drown out the memory of that muffled screaming. By some absolute miracle, I found the actual ranger cabin 3 hours later. I broke the emergency glass and used the hardline radio to contact search and rescue. I gave them Soren's exact coordinates, and I screamed at them to bring the police, telling them about the shack, the IDs, and the woman beneath the floor. They dispatched a specialized alpine rescue team and a medical helicopter as soon as the weather broke the next morning. They reached Soren just in time. He was profoundly hypothermic and lost 2 toes to severe frostbite, along with enduring months of brutal surgeries to rebuild his shattered leg. But he survived. The authorities took my frantic report about the shack extremely seriously. They sent a heavily armed team into the backcountry, guided by the coordinates and bearings I provided. They searched the grid exhaustively for 3 days, but the storm had dropped nearly 4 feet of fresh snow over the entire range. They found absolutely nothing. No corrugated steel, no metal chimney, no trapdoor. The detective I spoke to strongly suggested that the extreme cold, the severe physical exhaustion, and the psychological trauma of leaving my partner to die had induced a vivid survival hallucination. He told me the mind creates terrible things under that kind of extreme duress. I broke professional ties with Soren about a year later. The trauma of the trip was too much for our partnership to bear. I still work in the backcountry, but the psychological scars are permanent. There are 3 possibilities about what happened that day in the whiteout. The first is that the detective was right, and I hallucinated the entire terrifying ordeal. The second is that the shack was completely real, and the authorities simply couldn't find it under the massive snowpack, meaning I left a real, living woman trapped beneath the floorboards to die in the freezing dark. But the third possibility is the one that keeps me awake at night. The terrifying possibility that the trapdoor was empty and the screaming was just an elaborate recording wired to a pressure plate near the table, designed to panic whoever found the ledger, keeping them paralyzed by fear while the hunter returned from the tree line to lock the front door. When I was a sophomore in college, there was this girl in my advanced photography seminar that I spent an unhealthy amount of time analyzing. Her name was Maeve Sterling. She had this incredibly intimidating, almost magnetic presence about her that is honestly very difficult to articulate, but I will try my best to explain it. She was undeniably beautiful, but it was far more than just physical attraction. She had this dark, impenetrable mystique that you would never typically associate with a standard 20-year-old student. She was not popular. She did not attend parties, and I always got the distinct impression that the other students in the program were genuinely unnerved by her. She was never warm. She rarely smiled, and most people regarded her quiet, observant nature as incredibly arrogant. I didn't see it that way. I actually found her severe uniqueness deeply fascinating. Accidentally locking eyes with her across the lecture hall would completely freeze my train of thought, kind of like the physical shock of stepping out into freezing rain without a jacket. She reminded me of a deep, still lake, honestly. The kind of dark water that swallows the light completely, hiding whatever is moving beneath the surface. She had that exact quality, but it felt like no one else in the room noticed it but me. People just thought the way she isolated herself and never spoke during critiques was bizarre. But I was always dying to know exactly what she was analyzing behind those dead eyes. I was focusing entirely on portraiture that semester, which probably fueled the obsession. I was developing a lot of black and white film in the campus darkroom, and I actually used her as the uncredited subject for an entire psychological profile project. You could definitely say I was obsessed, but I also just found her facial structure and her complete lack of emotion to be the perfect artistic subject. Anyway, I was walking out of the studio one rainy Tuesday afternoon, talking with my roommate Julian about that exact photography project. He asked me who the anonymous girl in the shadows of my prints was. So, I told him. And of course, the absolute second I mentioned the name Maeve, who turns the corner of the brick hallway? But the actual Maeve Sterling, walking alone with her heavy canvas messenger bag. She stopped directly in front of us. She flashed me this incredibly subtle smirk, which was the absolute closest thing to a human smile you could ever pull out of her. And she looked right into my eyes and said, "You should probably learn to lower your voice when you are dissecting someone's personality in public." I was completely mortified, and my face burned hot with embarrassment. Julian awkwardly excused himself and practically ran down the hall, leaving me standing there looking like an absolute fool. She was already shifting her weight to walk past me, clearly not interested in hearing my stuttering apologies, and I knew my one window of interaction was rapidly closing. I do not know what kind of temporary insanity came over me, but right there in the damp hallway, I asked her if she wanted to go shoot landscape photos together that weekend. That actually got her to stop moving. She turned back around and gave me one of her famous, icy stares. She didn't even have to use words. Her dark eyes communicated everything perfectly, measuring me, calculating something I couldn't understand. But then, she completely shocked me. She actually nodded slowly, agreed, and pulled a pen out of her pocket. She wrote her phone number directly onto the palm of my hand. Then she told me she would pick the location and text me the coordinates, and she walked away down the corridor, not even giving me a single second to respond. I was stunned, but that is exactly how I ended up going on an isolated hike with the girl I had been secretly obsessing over for months. The hike was not my idea at all. Just for the record, none of the logistics were. She organized the entire itinerary, and I got the distinct, unspoken impression that I had absolutely no choice but to follow her exact instructions if I wanted this to happen. And at the time, I was completely fine with that arrangement. Fast forward to that Saturday morning, and Maeve is driving us out to this specific trail she had selected. It was located deep within Mount Tamalpais State Park in California, but it was not one of the popular, paved tourist routes near Muir Woods. The drive took nearly an hour and a half, winding up incredibly steep, narrow coastal roads, while a thick, heavy marine layer of fog rolled in from the Pacific Ocean. The drive felt agonizingly short, mainly because I was trapped entirely inside my own head, trying to think of intelligent things to say. Maeve had her window cracked open, letting the freezing mist blow into the car, and she was playing this droning, ambient instrumental music from her phone that perfectly matched her bleak aesthetic. We eventually pulled into this unpaved gravel turnout at the very base of a densely wooded fire road. There was only one other vehicle parked in the dirt lot, an older, rusted utility van with tinted windows. Maeve didn't even glance at it. She just killed the engine, grabbed her camera, and started walking into the fog. I scrambled to grab my gear and followed her into the tree line. For the first 30 minutes or so, the dynamic was actually incredible. Maeve was significantly more talkative than I had ever seen her on campus. Admittedly, her version of being talkative still involved long, heavy silences, but for her, it was an unprecedented amount of engagement. She asked me highly specific, almost probing questions about my life. She asked if my roommate knew exactly where we went. She asked if I had a close relationship with my family. And she asked if I carried a pocket knife when I hiked. I thought she was just making weird, edgy conversation, so I answered honestly. I told her no one really knew where I was, because she had kept the location a secret until this morning. The trail narrowed significantly after a few miles, and the towering redwood trees became impossibly dense. The fog was so thick that it felt like we were walking through a suspended cloud of gray water. We hadn't seen a single other hiker since the gravel parking lot. At a certain point, the main trail split into an unmarked fork. I asked Maeve which way we should go, and she pointed toward the descending right fork, without a single millisecond of hesitation. I asked her if she had hiked this specific route before, and she looked at me with completely dead eyes and said no. I found that response incredibly strange, especially considering how definitive and confident she seemed to be about the navigation, but I was too intimidated to question her logic. The right fork was noticeably unmaintained. The dirt was loose, and the path was severely overgrown with massive ferns and thorny blackberry bushes. I started to get this twisting, heavy feeling in my gut that we were definitely going the wrong way, but I wanted to impress her, so I kept my mouth shut. I must have been really focused on the uneven footing, because after about 10 minutes of descending into the ravine, I suddenly realized I could no longer hear the crunch of Maeve's boots behind me. The trail had gotten so dangerously narrow that we had been forced to walk single file, and I had taken the lead, because she had specifically gestured for me to go first to clear the spider webs. But when I finally turned around to check on her, she wasn't there. The foggy trail behind me was completely empty. I yelled her name into the mist. Maeve! Nothing but the muffled echo of my own voice bouncing off the wet redwood trunks. I didn't get a response. I was genuinely confused, not scared yet, just confused. So, I turned around and started hiking back up the steep incline, retracing my exact steps. I made it all the way back up to the unmarked fork in the trail, and she wasn't there either. I figured she had probably stopped to use the bathroom in the woods, and didn't want me to notice her stepping off the trail, which was a perfectly reasonable explanation for a girl to disappear for a moment. But I stood there in the freezing fog for 10 minutes. I looked around the perimeter and realized there was no side trail, no clearing, nowhere for her to comfortably wander off. She was simply gone. So, I decided to walk down the left fork, thinking maybe she had accidentally taken the wrong path while trying to catch up to me. To my immediate surprise, that side of the mountain was even more desolate, and the further I walked into the gloom, the less it felt like a state park, and the more it felt like an absolute trap. I kept calling her name loudly, feeling like a complete idiot, but my anxiety was starting to rapidly spike. I couldn't imagine any logical reason why she would have deliberately abandoned me in an unfamiliar forest, so I genuinely convinced myself that she had fallen down a ravine and was lying somewhere injured. Then, the silence of the woods was broken. I heard the sharp, unmistakable sound of a heavy branch snapping somewhere off to my left, deep in the impenetrable wall of trees. And then, when I squinted through the gray fog, I saw movement. A large, dark shape shifted smoothly, stepping behind the trunk of a massive, hollowed-out redwood. I instantly felt a wave of relief wash over me. I knew exactly what was going on. It was Maeve, playing some kind of twisted psychological prank on me. That behavior would have been entirely on brand for her dark sense of humor. So, I figured I would turn the tables on her and surprise her before she could jump out and scare me. I slowly walked off the trail, stepping over the rotting logs, creeping toward the massive tree trunk as quietly as my boots would allow. I held my breath, raised my camera, and at the absolute last second, I lunged around the side of the bark to flash her picture. But as my finger pressed the shutter, the flash illuminated the space, and I realized with absolute, paralyzing horror that it wasn't Maeve. It was a man. I was completely horrified, but it was entirely too late to retreat. I was standing mere inches away from this large, heavily muscular man, wearing a dark tactical jacket and a black surgical mask pulled up over his nose. He didn't flinch at the camera flash. He didn't seem surprised or scared in the slightest. His eyes were locked dead onto my face, and they were entirely devoid of empathy. In his right hand, he was casually holding a thick coil of heavy-duty plastic zip ties. I instinctively stumbled backward, tripping over an exposed root, and the masked man just stood there, staring down at me. Before he could make a move, I blurted out in a pathetic, shaking voice that I was just looking for my friend, that I had made a mistake. In hindsight, it was a completely useless, desperate thing to say to a predator. He clearly didn't care about my excuses. He took a slow, deliberate step toward me. I scrambled to my feet, turned my back to him, and started speed-walking back toward the dirt trail, fighting the overwhelming urge to break into a dead sprint. But then, I heard a second sound. This time, it came from the brush directly to my right. I snapped my head over and saw another person moving smoothly through the fog. The second man wasn't even attempting to hide his approach. He stepped out of the ferns and stood directly in the center of the trail, completely blocking my only route back up the mountain. He was wearing a dark hoodie pulled low over his forehead, and he was holding a heavy, rusted metal tire iron down by his side. That is when the fragile illusion of safety shattered completely, and I just ran. The second guy was blocking the path, so I abandoned the trail entirely. I threw myself down the steep, treacherous side of the ravine, sprinting blindly through the dense, thorny underbrush with absolutely no sense of direction. I was just praying there was a creek bed or another fire road at the bottom. The absolute second I started running, I heard heavy boots crashing through the brush behind me. Both men had instantly broken into a sprint, pursuing me down the hill. They weren't trying to be stealthy anymore. They were hunting me like an animal. I sprinted for maybe 30 seconds, but it was nearly impossible to maintain my balance because the muddy slope was so incredibly steep and slick. Before I could even brace for the impact, my foot caught under a buried rock and I pitched forward, tumbling violently down the muddy embankment. I hit the ground hard, the breath exploding from my lungs. Before I could even attempt to push myself up off the wet leaves, a heavy, gloved hand clamps down violently onto my right ankle. It was the first guy, the one with the zip ties. He had tackled my leg, and he was violently yanking me backward up the mud, trying to flip me over and pin my chest to the ground. I screamed in absolute primal terror. I kicked backward with my free boot, wildly thrashing in the dirt. By some absolute miracle of adrenaline, the heel of my boot connected squarely with the center of his masked face. I felt the sickening crunch of his nose breaking under the leather. He grunted in pain, and his grip loosened for a fraction of a second. I violently ripped my ankle free, scrambled back to my feet, abandoning my expensive camera in the mud, and kept running. My lungs were burning, and I could taste copper blood in the back of my throat. I did not look back. I don't think they continued the pursuit after I broke his nose, probably realizing I was making too much noise and the element of surprise was ruined. But I absolutely did not care to find out. I ran blindly through the thorns and the fog until I practically collapsed onto the paved shoulder of the main coastal highway. I kept running along the asphalt, completely terrified, until I finally navigated back to the gravel parking lot. Maeve's car was still parked exactly where she had left it, but the rusted utility van with the tinted windows was completely gone. The dirt lot was entirely empty. Maeve wasn't anywhere in sight, which sent a fresh wave of panic through my exhausted body. I leaned against her car, hyperventilating. I started genuinely thinking that those masked men who had just tried to abduct me had gotten to her first. I thought she was in mortal danger, locked in the back of that van. I didn't know what to do. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely unlock my phone screen. I must have called her number 10 consecutive times, and it went straight to voicemail every single ring. I was just typing the number for the police into my keypad, preparing to report a kidnapping, when my phone buzzed in my hand. It was a text from Maeve. It just said, "Where did you go?" I was frantically typing a warning response when I heard the crunch of gravel. I looked up and saw Maeve Sterling walking casually out of the dense, foggy tree line. Her clothes were perfectly clean. She was completely calm. Her breathing was slow and measured, and she was holding her camera in one hand, looking at the digital screen. I lunged toward her, screaming at her to unlock the car, frantically trying to explain that we had to leave immediately because there were men hunting people in the woods. But she didn't seem fazed by my panic in the slightest. I told her I had been attacked, that they had grabbed me. She looked at my torn clothes and mud-covered face, and she seemed significantly more irritated than concerned. Either way, she unlocked the doors, we got into the car, and she started driving us rapidly down the mountain. I recounted every single terrifying detail to her, my voice shaking, and she still didn't seem particularly moved by the horror of it, which was absolutely insane to me. She kept her eyes locked on the winding road, her expression completely blank. That is when I stopped yelling, and I finally demanded to know exactly where she had gone when she disappeared. She calmly told me, without breaking eye contact with the road, that she thought I had walked too far ahead without her, and that she was trying to catch up to me the entire time. She said she had just been walking on the main path, looking for me. I knew, with absolute chilling certainty, that it was a lie, because I had walked all the way back up to the fork. I had stood there in the silence. There is absolutely no physical way I would have missed her walking on that narrow path. I sat back against the passenger seat, staring at her pale profile in the dim light of the car. That is the exact moment it dawned on me, that she didn't just stumble upon those men. She had something to do with it. What that specific something could have been, whether it was a setup for a robbery, a gang initiation, or something far darker involving human trafficking, I had absolutely no idea. The hour-long ride back to campus was the tensest, most terrifying experience of my life. I kept looking over at her, listening to the rhythmic clicking of her turn signal, and wondering whether someone who looked so quiet and artistic could be capable of doing something so intensely heartless and violently cruel. Honestly, looking at her dead, unblinking eyes in the rearview mirror, the answer was probably yes. She dropped me off a block away from my apartment building. We didn't even say goodbye. I got out, she drove away into the rain, and I was finally alone. I was still in such deep shock from the entire encounter. I couldn't get over the fact that within literal minutes of Maeve disappearing, 2 armed strangers appeared in the exact isolated stretch of woods she had intentionally led me into. The specific trail she picked, the overgrown fork she chose, and the vulnerable position she put me in by demanding I walk in front of her. It felt entirely orchestrated, a perfectly executed trap. And then she just casually strolled out of the woods after the violent struggle had ended, without a single scratch on her face, gaslighting me by asking where I went. We did not speak a single time after that day. I dropped the photography seminar the following Monday morning. I never attempted to reach out to her to demand the truth, and if I wasn't reaching out to her, there was absolutely zero chance she was ever going to contact me. I have told maybe 3 or 4 people this story over the years, and their response is always exactly the same. Maeve deliberately set me up. She knew the exact layout of the trail, and she knew exactly who those men in the woods were. I have considered that horrifying reality more times than I can count, but I just have absolutely no idea why anyone would target me like that. I have no idea where Maeve Sterling is living now. She never had any social media profiles. She dropped out of the university a semester later, and she completely vanished. But every time I see a thick layer of fog roll in over the trees, I think about her dark, calculating eyes, and I wonder how many other boys she asked to lead the way down an empty trail. I was living alone in a small ground-floor flat just outside the city center of Bath when this happened. It was an old converted Victorian place at the end of a long, narrow residential street. There were only 4 other partitioned flats in the building, and at night it was usually completely quiet. I worked from home doing freelance software testing, so most days I didn't leave unless I had to get groceries. I didn't get visitors often. My friends usually texted before coming over. That's why the first knock stood out. It was around 10:15 at night on a Tuesday. I was in the living room watching TV when I heard 3 frantic knocks on the front door. I muted the TV and waited, thinking maybe I imagined it. Then there were 2 more knocks, much louder this time. I got up and walked to the door. There's a small peephole in the center of it. When I looked through, I saw a young woman standing on my porch holding a thick winter coat tight around her shoulders. She was soaking wet and looked like she had been crying. She looked normal, maybe early 20s. I opened the door, but kept the heavy security chain on. She immediately said that her car had broken down the road and her phone battery was dead. She begged to come inside, just for a minute, to use my phone to call her boyfriend. It didn't feel right. Her clothes were wet, but it hadn't rained at all that evening. I told her I could make the call for her, but I wasn't letting anyone inside. She looked down at her hands, then at the door frame, then back at me. She gave a street name where her car supposedly was. It wasn't my street. It wasn't even close. I told her she had the wrong neighborhood. She stared at me for a second longer than necessary. Her crying completely stopped in an instant. Then she said, "Never mind. that she must have been given the wrong directions and would just walk to the petrol station instead. I watched her walk back down the street. I expected to see a broken-down car parked somewhere nearby with its hazard lights on, but there was nothing. She walked past the street lamp and turned the corner at the end of the road. I didn't see where she went. I shut the door and locked it. I told myself she was just a confused kid who got lost after a night out, or maybe a stranded driver who didn't know the area. The next night, at almost the exact same time, there were 3 knocks again. This time, I didn't open the door right away. I went to the peephole first. It was a man this time, wearing a heavy puffer jacket. I didn't open the door. I just spoke through it and told him to leave. He didn't answer right away. Then he said he was looking for his girlfriend, that she had knocked on my door last night and hadn't come home. I told him she left and I didn't know where she went. There was a long pause. Then he said, "Okay," and stepped back from the door. I stayed at the peephole. Instead of walking away right away, he stood at the edge of the front path, looking at the flat. He slowly turned his head toward my living room windows, then toward the side gate, then back at the door. After about 15 seconds, he finally walked down the street. Again, I saw no vehicle. That's when it started to feel wrong. On the 3rd night, there was no knock. I actually felt relieved. I thought maybe they figured out their situation. I even joked to myself about how weird it would have been if they showed up again. On the 4th night, I was in the kitchen washing dishes around 10 p.m. when I heard 4 frantic knocks. It wasn't on the front door. It was on the side of the building near my bedroom window. I slowly walked into the bedroom and looked toward the window, but no one was there. Then there were 4 more knocks at the front door. I went to the peephole, and it was the woman again, crying loudly. But this time, she wasn't wearing the coat. Her hands were empty. I didn't say anything, and she knocked again. Then she stepped back, stopped crying instantly, and looked directly at the peephole. I stepped away from the door so she couldn't see movement, and I didn't make a sound. After about 30 seconds, she turned and walked away. I waited 5 full minutes before checking the windows. I walked around the flat with the lights off and looked through the blinds. I saw the man standing across the street near the alleyway. He was just standing there, facing my flat. After maybe a minute, he walked off into the darkness. I relocked every window and door again, even though they were already locked. The next day, I called the local police non-emergency line and explained what had been happening. The officer I spoke to said it sounded like a targeted home invasion tactic. He said sometimes violent burglars will use a distressed woman to see if someone opens the door to help, and once you unchain it, men waiting out of sight will rush in and force entry. He told me to make sure all my windows were deadbolted and to call 999 if the woman came back. That night, I left all the lights off in the front of the flat and stayed in my bedroom. Around 10:15, right on time, there were frantic knocks. I didn't respond at all. After a few seconds, 4 more, then silence. I waited about a minute, then I heard something else. A soft thud against the back fence of my patio, and then another. I realized it sounded like someone dropping onto the concrete from the wall. I grabbed my phone and quietly walked into the kitchen. I could hear the back patio door handle moving slowly, pushing in and then pulling out. I called 999 like I was instructed and whispered that someone was trying to get into my flat. While I was on the phone, the crying and knocking started again at the front door. The dispatcher told me officers were on the way. The back door handle kept rattling. There was definitely more than one person. Then I heard the sound of something heavy scraping lightly against the glass frame. After about 30 seconds, the siren sounded in the distance, and everything stopped. Even as it was totally silent, though, I stayed on the phone until the police arrived. When they searched the outside of the flat, they found fresh crowbar marks on the patio door frame. The officer told me if I had opened that front door to help the woman, the men at the back would have smashed through the glass simultaneously. They drove around, but didn't find anyone suspicious. The next night, I stayed at a friend's place across town. I didn't tell anyone on social media or anything that I wasn't home. I just left. Around 10 p.m., my phone rang. It was my neighbor from the upstairs flat. He said there was a woman standing on my porch, crying and knocking repeatedly. He said she had been there for at least 5 minutes. He asked if I was home. I told him no and asked if he saw any men hiding nearby. He said he didn't see anyone. I told him to call the police. Officers arrived quickly and caught her trying to leave the street. Later that night, an officer called me and said the woman claimed her car broke down and she was just looking for help. But she had no car keys on her and couldn't point to where her vehicle was. They took her in for questioning. 2 days later, police arrested 2 men connected to her in a nearby neighborhood after they were caught attempting to rush a homeowner who had opened his door to help her. In their van, they found duct tape, weapons, and a list of addresses. During questioning, she admitted she would use the fake distress story first. If someone answered and opened the door completely, the men would rush in. If no one answered after multiple attempts, they would come back later and force entry from the back. She told detectives that sometimes they would knock several nights in a row to see if they could break the homeowner's caution. If the person seemed empathetic on the first night, they assumed they could bait them outside later. Hearing that made me realize how close I was to opening the door that first Tuesday. If I had ignored my gut feeling and opened the door on one of those early nights to hand her my phone, they probably would have forced their way inside immediately. I moved out of that flat 3 months later when my lease ended. I still don't answer the door at night unless I know exactly who's coming over. If someone knocks unexpectedly, I stay quiet and check the security cameras first. And if anyone ever shows up looking like they need urgent help in the middle of the night, I don't even go near the door anymore. I just call the police. This story starts in the lead up to Christmas. To set the scene, I live near the coast in Portland, Maine. I stay with my parents, my older brother, and our 2 golden retrievers. We're a close-knit family and often spend the cold winter nights together in the living room, watching TV, playing board games, and just catching up on our lives. At the time of this story, I was 16, turning 17. I was in my junior year of high school, but really looking forward to the winter break. In the days leading up to Christmas, during one of those freezing late nights together, we were watching Home Alone. We always do a movie marathon around the holidays, and it's honestly my favorite part of the season. During the movie, we heard a loud knock at the front door. This happened a lot with late package deliveries, so we didn't think much of it. My mom got up to answer it, expecting a box on the porch, but nobody was there. The driveway was empty. Our property has a wraparound porch that goes from the front door all the way to the backyard, so she checked along the side of the house too. But there was nobody there either. She locked the door, came back inside, and we just resumed the movie. A few days later, I was sitting at the kitchen island wrapping presents when I heard another knock. I put the scissors down and went to look through the front window, but again, nobody was there. We assumed it was probably neighborhood kids playing a prank. Where I'm from, middle schoolers sometimes get bored during the winter break and cause trouble instead of finding something better to do. In America, everyone knows the game Ding Dong Ditch, where kids knock on someone's door and run away laughing. It's annoying, but as a kid, the adrenaline rush of someone opening the door to nobody there can be weirdly fun. We have a family group chat where we share grocery lists and random updates, and throughout that week, my brother mentioned experiencing the same thing. The incident that stood out the most, though, was something my dad experienced. At the time, my dad usually stayed up way later than everyone else, either watching sports highlights or doing crossword puzzles once the house was totally quiet. One night, around 11:45 p.m., when the snow was falling heavily and all the kids would have been fast asleep, he heard a very distinct, quiet knock. He was confused because of the late hour. He checked the security camera feed on his phone before opening the door, but the porch was completely empty. He slowly unlocked the deadbolt and opened the door to look outside into the snow. Again, nobody was there, just a quiet, freezing street with no footprints on the walkway. He locked the door and came upstairs to ask if anyone else had heard it, but because the knock was so faint, nobody else had. This started to make us feel a bit uneasy because it kept happening repeatedly. Nobody had ever seen a delivery truck, or heard kids laughing, or found footprints in the snow. It was just the knocking itself. This felt different. Christmas Day is when everything completely escalated. We spent the entire day with our extended family opening presents, sharing gifts, watching basketball, and eating way too much heavy holiday food. It was a really great day. Later that night, I felt almost sick from eating so much dessert, which I honestly always do on Christmas. So I went upstairs to lie down early. I ended up dozing off and woke up several hours later. When I checked my phone, the screen glowed 2:15 a.m. Everyone else was in bed and the house was completely silent. I knew I wouldn't be able to fall back asleep right away. Once I wake up in the middle of the night, my brain just stays awake. I stayed on my phone in the dark, scrolling through social media instead of turning my bedroom TV on, looking at what my friends got for Christmas. After a while, I heard a faint knock. I wasn't sure if it came from the front door, the back deck, or if I had just imagined it. I sat up straight in bed, staring into my dark room with my heart suddenly racing. I didn't want to move. I knew absolutely nobody should be outside at 2 a.m. in the middle of a Maine winter. I didn't know if the past few weeks of prank knocks were just getting into my head, or if someone was actually out there. After what felt like an eternity, I finally worked up the courage to open my bedroom door just a crack. As I did, I heard what sounded like heavy, wet boots squeaking on the hardwood floor downstairs. My brain immediately assumed it was my older brother coming into the kitchen to grab a late-night leftover turkey sandwich. I stepped out onto the landing to whisper down to him and ask if he could bring me a bottle of water. That's when I heard the heavy footsteps moving into the living room, followed by the sound of tearing paper. I realized it wasn't my brother. I leaned over the wooden banister and looked down into the dim light of the living room. There was a woman I had never seen before in my entire life. I immediately felt sick to my stomach when I saw her. I wondered if she was the person behind all the knocking all week. She was already inside the house, wearing a soaked, oversized parka. She was tearing open the remaining Christmas gifts under our tree and aggressively stuffing the items into a large canvas bag. I slowly backed away from the railing, luckily without her looking up to see me, and I quietly tiptoed down the hall. I ran straight into my parents' room and shook them awake, whispering frantically that there was a woman robbing the house downstairs. My mom gasped and sat up instantly, while my dad jumped out of bed, completely wide awake. We went downstairs together, my dad leading the way. We found the woman sitting on our living room floor, drinking straight from a bottle of wine she had pulled from our fridge. My dad shouted at her, asking who she was and what she was doing. She looked up, completely unfazed, and angrily insisted that we were trespassing in her cabin. We told her the police were being called, but she just laughed and said she had lived here for 10 years. She was entirely delusional, slurring her words and acting incredibly erratic. My dad eventually had to physically grab her by the sleeves of her thick coat and drag her toward the front door. He forced her out onto the snowy porch and warned her never to come back before slamming the heavy door and locking it. We thought it was finally over, but seconds later, a loud crash echoed through the hallway. Glass suddenly shattered inward, covering the entryway rug. The woman had picked up a heavy decorative lantern from the porch and smashed it through the door's glass pane. She pushed her face right up to the broken, jagged edges, screaming aggressive threats. She yelled that she knew our faces and that she was going to have us arrested for breaking into her home. Needless to say, we were all in total shock. It was terrifying to see someone act so unhinged on Christmas night. Eventually, she stumbled away into the dark, and the police arrived about 10 minutes later. They took statements from all of us, and my dad boarded up the broken window with some plywood. Because of the fresh snow that had fallen earlier that evening, it was easy for the officers to track her. There was a clear trail of muddy, erratic footprints leading down the street. Police followed it to a 24-hour convenience store a few blocks away, where they found the woman trying to buy cigarettes while covered in snow and holding our torn wrapping paper. They arrested her on the spot and later confirmed she was the intruder. Our glass pane was replaced 2 days later. It turned out she was a vacation renter who had booked an Airbnb 3 streets over. She had taken a dangerous mix of prescription medication and alcohol at a holiday party, became completely disoriented, and wandered to our house. She claimed she thought she was locked out of her rental, found our spare key hidden under a potted plant, which we foolishly hadn't moved in years, and let herself in. Thankfully, nobody in our family was physically hurt. She was charged with breaking and entering and property damage. But to this day, we still have no explanation for the quiet knocking that happened in the weeks before that night. The police said she had only arrived in town on Christmas Eve. So, even now, sometimes I lie awake and feel like I hear a faint knock late at night. Maybe it's just the wind, or maybe it isn't. I guess I'll never know who was really out there testing our doors all those nights before.